What are we talking about today, Adam? The new features for 2020.4. You're going to show us a demo of structured configuration variables, which is taking that JSON configuration feature that we've had for so long and expanding that out to even more file types. And then I'm going to jump in with some updates to dynamic worker pools for our Octopus Cloud customers. We're going to talk about execution containers, a new feature that's been in early access for the last few months or the last few releases, so even many months now, that's now in GA. A few smaller improvements, usually a few around Kubernetes. And we're going to just mention this briefly. We're not going to show this later, but the SQL requirements that were raised to SQL Server 2017 earlier this year have been relaxed with 2020.4. So if you've been putting off an update because you didn't have access to SQL Server 2017, that has been relaxed. You can use 2020.4 with SQL Server 2016. And without any further talking on bullet points, let's do a demo. Adam, are you ready to talk about the structured configuration variables?
I am. Thank you, Ryan. I'll take over. Yeah, hey again, everybody. So, structured configuration variables. Ryan just slightly touched on that, and it's an improvement to existing feature that's been in Octopus for a long time, probably way before I started using it, or definitely before I joined Octopus, and it was previously known as JSON configuration variables. So prior to 2020.4, you could define variables in Octopus to replace values in your JSON configuration variables. With that, you didn't need any kind of special token or placeholder in your config files. You could define the variable name. So Octopus would go into your JSON configuration file, look for the value to replace, and replace that as you progress your deployments through development, test, and production. So with 2020.4, it's been renamed from JSON configuration variables to structured configuration variables. And that's now because we've added support for additional file types. So we've now got support for YAML, XML, and Java property files. And that's really exciting for anybody who is deploying Java applications and other similar applications to Java that use YAML or Java property files as configuration stores. So yeah, it's going to be making those deployments a lot smoother. So what we'll do, we're going to be deploying a really basic sample application today. And this sample application essentially just kind of sucks in a number of different configuration files and displays them over in our Google Chrome. So you can see we've got a JSON configuration file, YAML, XML, and Java. And go back to my project, we can see here we've got the JSON configuration file, Java properties file, and XML, and YAML. So the first thing we need to do to get this up and running, we need to tell Octopus about these configuration files in our package. So we go ahead and do that. Go to Octopus, go into my configuration viewer project. So this is the Nginx Node.js application. I've got one simple step to deploy that out to my virtual machine. So that's what we need to do to enable the structured configuration variable features. So you can find that in configure features. You may, some people in the audience may have this turned on already for JSON configuration variables, but you'll now see structured configuration variables. Okay, and once we enable this feature, what we kind of do is tell Octopus where the configuration files are that we want to replace values in. So we're going to create some variables in Octopus that match the hierarchy or keys in our configuration file. So we need to kind of tell them where they're in our package. So if we look at our package again, we can see it's all in the root of the package. So what I need to do is I can specify the relative path and the full file name, but what I'm going to do is use a wildcard. I'm going to ask Octopus to look for all JSON files, all YAML files, I'll make sure I get that right, YAML, rather than typing YAML.
Yeah, it'll work with both. It just depends on how you've named your files.
Yes.
While you're typing, I was going to see if I
Exactly.
can distract you while you're typing. If I am upgrading from an older version to 2020.4 and I have this enabled as JSON configuration variables, the former version of this feature, do I need to do anything during the upgrade?
So the simple answer is no, which is great news. So if you're already using the JSON configurations variables feature, you don't have to do anything. You might be wondering, you may have had rather than having .json, you may have had like .config. What Octopus is going to do when it tries to replace variables in these configuration files, it's always going to try and parse the file as JSON first. If that then fails, it will look at this specific file type and then parse either as JSON, YAML, properties, or XML. So yeah, good news. If you're using that feature, you don't have to go back through all your steps and update anything.
No, that sounds great. You just got to be aware the name has changed. So it may, and I noticed that I did this the first few times I went to like enable it again. I was like, I was looking for JSON and the name changed. So you just have to be aware that the name did change, but that's all that matters.
Yeah, I've been working on this a week and I still keep looking for JSON configuration variables. So I'm on with you there. Okay, so we've specified all the files that I want to replace variables in. And we can see you've used a wildcard just to look for any target files like JSON, YAML, properties, or XML. Go ahead and hit save. So now we can start defining our variables. So I've got a couple in here already. We've got some just to deploy our application, the engine export and Node.js port, and they're just to power the application. We'll touch on the other variables I've created in just a second. So it's really important how you name your variables. So Octopus uses the variable name to identify the object or key in your configuration file. So each configuration file has a separate syntax apart from YAML and JSON. They're both the same. So what I'll do, I'll just go and demonstrate that. So we take the JSON file first. And we can see here the hierarchy we've got login and app settings. If I want to replace the app version and environment name, I need to give a specific name to the variable to access for Octopus to replace the app version variable value. So what I'm going to do is just jump over to our docs. You can see our docs here. We can see the format, whether it's JSON, YAML, XML, or Java property files. We can see these little JSON objects here. The Octopus variable name is split with app::port. And the Octopus variable value, we can see the output file. So for JSON and YAML, it's split by a column. So I'm going to go ahead and create those first ones. So we're going to have a look. We've got app settings and app version. So go settings. For the value, we're going to use an inbuilt system variable from Octopus, so we can see the variable substitution for values is still working. Release. And hit save. That's the list. So next it was, I want to replace the environment name. Go ahead, settings, name. Again, we use another system variable for this. Name, and close off. Cool. So, next file. We're going to take a look at the YAML file. So I'm going to go to the YAML first. So it follows the same kind of syntax as JSON. So if I want to swap out the port value in this configuration file. So it's going to be server::port. Again, third column hot. I'll just change that to 99. And again, let's take a look. We want to this time replace the URL. So if we take a look at the hierarchy here, we've got Spring, data source, then URL. So go ahead, Spring, data source, URL, and I'll take a copy of that URL. What I'm going to do is just where it says test database, and I change that to the environment name. Oop. Actually, let me get the system variables right.
So this is really handy for replacing single values. I noticed you had some more complex variables down towards the bottom.
Yeah, definitely. So what I'm doing there, I'm picking out individual values to replace. The structure configuration variables is quite powerful, and you could swap out the entire object, whether that's JSON or YAML, or replace the entire array that I'm doing down here. So if we take a look at that login and the objects I've got here, go back into the JSON, I'm replacing the entire JSON object, and then back into the YAML, replacing the entire users array, and that's very useful for if you are changing every value in an object or an array, rather than specifying a variable name for each key pair. It's probably easier just to kind of swap out the entire object inside the value instead of specifying each key pair individually.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's nice that you could be able to do that. And it was an existing feature with the JSON substitution, but now that'll work with YAML and the rest too.
YAML as well, yes.
I guess it doesn't make sense for the Java properties, right? Those are just straight value pairs.
Yeah, so we'll jump into that in a second. So there's no hierarchical kind of structure in Java property configuration files. And to specify the name of the key pair. So we'll go ahead and do that next. So if we take a look at our Java properties file, you can see here it's server port and a value. So we've got name, value, same Spring profiles active equals dev. So we'll change these out. So what I'll do, I'll just grab that. Save me typing that out. Let's change that again to, let's say 888. So all you're doing here for the Java property files is just taking the name of the configuration key and inputting it as the variable name, and Octopus will do that matching on that for you. Same again with, go on, Ryan.
I was going to say, yeah, I like how it follows the pattern of the config format. So for the YAML and the JSON, a colon, separating the keys makes sense because that's what you use to declare that hierarchy. And then Spring, not Spring, but the Java properties files is just keys with dots separating the categories. So that's kind of nice that it follows the convention for the file you're using.
Yeah, I'm not. I'll probably say an expert in Java property files, and I think that key pair can be that configuration key can be named whatever. But I think it's good practice to still separate those with dots. Kind of give it some hierarchical configuration. I'm going to go to environment name. That's the list. And the last file I want to inject variables values into is XML. So if we take a look at this XML file, the value I want to replace in this XML is our Octopus API key. So if we take a look at the hierarchical configuration here, so we've got configuration. Next in there is services, Octopus, and key. Now, so Octopus can find that how we do that is slash configuration slash, oh, I kind of forgot that already. Bad memory. Services Octopus and then key. So, okay, worth noting, Octopus is using XPath to locate the variable name in the XML. So as long as you're using valid XPath version 1 or 2, Octopus will find the whether you're replacing an attribute or an element inside your XML configuration file. Change this to this is my Octopus key. Doesn't look like an Octopus key, but just for demo purposes, we'll use that. You probably have that changed to a sensitive value type in the real world. That's a list. So just quite quickly on the XML stuff I was just talking about, where I will extend that out so you can see this a little better. You can see here we've got configuration, system web, custom errors, and app mode. So we used a little bit of XPath magic to swap out an attribute on the on our XML configuration file. So we're going to turn mode off to on. Cool. I'll go ahead and hit save. I'm going to deploy this out. Hit deploy. Just give this a second. Open the task log up. Cool. So just quickly, we've successfully deployed that to development. And we can see here, I'll try and find that actually, just 1 second. So I kind of show you the process of replacing the content.
It's right there. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's always going to try and pass the configuration file as JSON first, and if that fails, it's then going to go ahead and pass it with the right file extension. That's cool. So what I'm going to do, go ahead, check my application. I can see the URL in our YAML has changed, the URL and the port. Go down to the Octopus API key in XML. This is my Octopus key. Customer mode's off. I think I set that to off for yes, for development. We can see the Java properties file have changed as well, along with the JSON. We can see the app version has changed and the environment name. I'll just deploy that out to test as well.
Yeah, while you're deploying that, I think there's something that's worth pointing out with these features. I came up with JSON a few times. It's similar for YAML, and we've had people ask, how do you make sure that like a number goes in as a number in JSON or YAML and not a hard-coded string? Or likewise, you've got to include scopes as true. Like, how do you make sure those values stay the same type? And what the way it works is when Octopus does the substitution, it's going to try and convert the new value into the type of the existing value in the file. So if you have, if you were to try and write a number to the include scopes key or a section of the JSON or the YAML, it would actually fail and give you a deployment error because it would try to parse that as a Boolean and it wouldn't work. So as long as the existing file has a placeholder variable of the type that you're expecting or that you want, Octopus will do that conversion for you.
Yeah, cool. So I'll just go through the test site. So it's really nice on a different part. You can see now the environment name has changed to test, same version, same in the YAML, and so on with the XML. So Cool. So to recap, JSON configuration variables is now structured configuration variables. Now we've added support for YAML, XML, and property configuration files. It's worth noting at this point, if we've not added support for a particular configuration file that you're using, but you still want to use variables in Octopus to inject values into your configuration files, you still do that using variable substitution. You just need to have a kind of token or placeholder in your configuration file that Octopus knows to look for. So if your configuration files fall outside of YAML, XML, JSON, or Java properties, you can still use the variable substitution in Octopus. That kind of wraps up my part of the demo, Ryan. If there's any questions, I'll hand over to you and you can take them through the other cool features.
Sounds good. No questions yet, but if anybody, if you're watching, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in there and we'll answer as we can. And for now, we'll switch over to my screen. You can tell it's a different demo. I'm still using the old school light mode. I have not upgraded to dark mode like Adam has on my Octopus instances. But we're going to start this part of the demo by looking at dynamic worker pools. And this is specifically a cloud feature. If you've adopted Octopus Cloud or migrated to Octopus Cloud, you'll know that for a while we've had dynamic workers that were Windows-based for running your deployment steps. We've now added dynamic Linux worker pools. So if we go into add a worker pool, once this loads, you'll see you'll be able to choose from static or dynamic. And once you choose dynamic, you can choose what image to use with the worker, either Windows Server Core 2016 or 2019, or Ubuntu 18.04. And these images will have all of the tools that you need to use any of the built-in steps. So you don't have to spin up your own machine on either your infrastructure in the cloud to be used as workers, unless you have another need, a tool that's not installed there. Then in that case, you could set up static workers for your Octopus Cloud instance. So I'm going to go and switch to a project where I'm going to use this dynamic worker. And I think, yeah, so we got our Octwilio project. And as I'm going into this project, I'm also going to kind of shift towards container images. But you can see I do have my hosted Ubuntu, my dynamic Ubuntu worker pool selected. And I've also got a container image. So this is execution containers. This has been in EAP for the last few releases, so you may be familiar with it. If you're not familiar with a container image or execution containers, instead of running your deployment process, your step, your script, what you have in your deployment process, or even in your runbook, instead of running that on a worker that has specific tooling installed, you can run that on a worker that has Docker installed. And then you would choose an image that contains the tooling, the CLI, or whatever you need for that step. And the logic of the step will actually run inside that Docker container instead of on the worker directly. So your two choices are the default, which is going to run directly on the worker, and it's going to expect the worker to have everything installed needed to run that task. Or you can choose to run it inside a container on a worker from that pool. Our dynamic workers do have Docker installed, so that is something that you can use straight away if you are starting to adopt this. Now, I should mention with 2020.4, the reason we're talking about execution containers again is they are now in GA, generally available. The EAP feature flag snuck through a few releases. So if you're on 2020.4.1.2, you may still have to enable it, or you definitely will still have to enable it through configuration and features. But once you upgrade to 2020.4.4, then it is going to be a full feature. You won't have to enable it. It'll be enabled by default, and the EAP icon will disappear. So if you are on 2020.4 and wondering why you may not have this option available, you may be on one of the first editions of 2020.4, and you need to enable it through the feature flag. Now, why would I, Adam, you may be asking yourself, why would I want to use or run my step within a Docker container? If I'm already running it on a worker, why would I run it on a container inside a worker? And really the reason for that is it gives you a little bit more control over exactly what you're running, because you can choose a specific container image with a specific tool version, unless you're doing what I do here and I just use the latest tag, but you can set this to a specific tool set and run it on that worker. And also you won't have to manage those workers and install all of the all the tooling on them directly and then keep that upgraded. You would only need Docker installed on that worker. So instead of having Terraform and the AWS CLI and the Firebase CLI on either different workers or trying to install it on all your workers, you can make them more generic and just have Docker on them and run these steps within that container.
Yeah, start there, right? I can imagine the workers can get quite bloated with all the different bits of software you have to install on them. As well, it's like doing Windows patching or Linux patching. If anything happens to that worker, to then go off and have to reinstall all the tools required for that worker can be a nightmare. So just be able to kind of chuck that machine away, bring a new one online with Docker on, and just pull the same images. Just a lot quicker and kind of less manageability of the actual worker itself.
Yeah, exactly. Why bother, keeping a machine up to date when you can tear it down and rebuild it? And as long as it has Docker, it'll still, continue working. I do want to point out too, I'm using one of my custom built containers, but we also have containers available for you. So if you want to use a Linux-based image or a Windows-based image, you can click the links below the text area to choose one of those. And these are container images that we provide that have all of the tooling needed to run the built-in steps. Now, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to use a dynamic worker and use one of these containers on that, because the dynamic worker has these tools available as well. But I'm using a custom container, so I'm going to go ahead and discard these changes and create a release and deploy it, and we'll see what it looks like during a deployment. Now, dynamic workers are great because you don't have to set it up. You don't have to set up a static worker and maintain and manage that. But there is some trade-offs to the dynamic worker. And Adam, I know we've talked about this a number of times, but it could be that it takes a while for this dynamic worker to generate. It's the first time you've run a task in a while, it's the first time you've run this step in a certain time period, that worker is not going to be there. It's going to have to spin up, which could take some time. Especially with Docker containers. If you're using a large Docker container and it's the first time you've pulled it, it will take time for that Docker container to pull down. Now, this one went pretty quick because I've already run these today, so it's already ready. The dynamic worker was ready to go. The image was already pulled, so it really didn't have much work to do, but it did upload my package, and now it is running that step inside that container on my dynamic worker.
Yeah, so there's a couple of caveats to that you essentially having to wait for the worker and also the worker to then pull the image. Do you have any so if I need to get an urgent deployment out, can you think of any workarounds to that to kind of speed that up before deployment?
Yeah, definitely. It depends on exactly what you're looking to speed up. With the dynamic workers, they do go away after an hour of idle time. They'll be decommissioned and you'll have to get a new one. So if you wanted to keep them around, as long as you're doing some task on them, once an hour, they will stick around. But even after that, 24 hours is their max lifespan. So after 24 hours, you'll be getting a new one anyway. So you could run some task on the worker to keep it leased. The other thing you can do with your Docker images is to maybe run some runbooks or some tasks against those whatever workers that you're going to be running on to pre-pull those images before you do a deployment. So, and that's especially that's probably more helpful with static workers. So you have your own set of workers with Docker installed. You could run some scripts to go in and make sure daily that they've got the latest version of all the images that you're going to use, that they have the latest version pulled just to speed up your deployment so it doesn't have to pull a new version.
All right. Helpful.
looks like that's still running, but we don't need, well, it finished. I was going to say we don't really need the output because the important part was right here. So now let's switch over to a few upgrades to Kubernetes, our Kubernetes functionality, and then we'll do an outro. All right, so I've got a deploy Kubernetes step, and this is using the forms-based one, the opinionated one, where you can fill in all of the information about your Kubernetes deployment. And within the containers section, there's a new section that we've added that is a new feature in Kubernetes 1.16. So if you're using Kubernetes, you're deploying to Kubernetes 1.15 or earlier, then this won't be there. And if you try to use it, you may actually get an error because the YAML will have information in it that doesn't make sense to that version of Kubernetes. That happened to me earlier this week. And if you are on 1.16, this is a alpha feature, so you would have to have the alpha features enabled. It wouldn't crash if it's all startup probe there. It just wouldn't necessarily do anything because if you don't have the feature enabled, it wouldn't be there. Now, what a startup probe is, it's similar to a liveness probe, which is your health check to make sure that the container, the service that you're deploying is still running healthy, that is still in good working order. And if it ever fails the liveness probe and hits the failure threshold, it'll be torn down and recreated. Startup probe is similar. It's got the same settings and really the same function, but you really only run it once, and that's at, as the name suggests, startup of your container. So it's going to start up, and you can give it more, let's say, more graceful thresholds. So I can let it try 30 times. Say it's got a long startup process. It's loading a bunch of data. It's got to wait for other connections to come online. I can say, hey, I'm going to check you 10 seconds apart, 30 times, and hopefully you're started by then. But if you're not, we're going to shut down and fail. So that is a startup probe that you can use with deploying to Kubernetes. Like I said, starting in 1.16 alpha and later, but this form is available now in 2020.4. And finally, with Kubernetes, we've added to our Kubernetes cluster target a pretty frequently requested feature, which is when we're setting up a Kubernetes cluster target that is a EKS instance, so the AWS Kubernetes service instance, you can now choose to have it either assume the IAM role of the worker that the step, the deployment process is running on, or you can have it assume a different IAM role by providing the details. So this was something you could do already with the raw YAML step and using the AWS CLI step options within your deployment process, but now you can set it on the Kubernetes cluster target directly and use it within that more opinionated form-based step that we were just looking at. So pretty frequently requested update there that has made it into 2020.4. All right, now let's switch back to the slides and jump into a Q&A. I see we do have a question in Zoom. And it's, what about deploy to a swarm? All right, and so this is be deploying to Docker Swarm versus Kubernetes. We do have, you can do that with Octopus. We have some examples that we can share. We can put that in a link in the email that goes out. But I will also
we can certainly do that.
Put an answer. I can jump back to mine as well, and maybe that will help. I won't go through the whole sample, but I will show the link. But we'll put this link in the email that goes out. So we do have a Docker Swarm sample available on samples.octopus.app. And you can log into this instance with guest access. So not only are there examples for Docker, we have examples for Windows, for Linux, Java, .NET, Node, a large array of samples here. So again, samples.octopus.app, we'll put a link to that and specifically this in the email that goes out. You have guest access, so you can come in here and see how those would work, how they'd be set up. And if you have any questions after the fact, you've looked at it and you still have questions about how to deploy Docker Swarm or anything else on samples, you can always email advice@octopus.com and we can get a personalized answer to you for your specific question. All right. Any other questions?
I think that kind of wraps questions up. Quite quiet today. Just going to do a double check the Slack channel. Looks like we're good to wrap up, Ryan.
All right. Well, if you do have questions after that, again, we are sending an email, so you can reply directly to that email with your question, or always you can email advice@octopus.com. But otherwise, we'll end this webinar Wednesday, this release webinar of 2020.4. Hopefully you enjoyed the look at the new features. It gave you some ideas of what to use. Speaking of newer features, we do have Octopus Runbooks webinar. So self-service DevOps with Octopus Runbooks. They've been around all year, but it's still one of my favorite new features. There's so much you can do with Runbooks. If you have not looked into those yet, or maybe you're just upgrading to a new version and you're just now getting the access to Runbooks, October 28th, 2 weeks from today, Derek and Bob are going to give you a rundown and a very thorough demo of Octopus Runbooks. If you want more information about deploying getting started with Octopus Deploy, and specifically getting started with Octopus deploying Java apps, come back 2 weeks from that, 4 weeks from today, November 11th, 11/11, you can see Adam and Sean do a demo of Java applications and setting up those projects within Octopus.
We can really flex out those new structure configuration variable features with Java and YAML, so they're looking forward to doing that one.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Are you going to show, do you know, are you showing Java properties, or are you showing YAML, or are you going to do both?
I think we're going to do a little bit of both. So natively, a lot of people use the Java property files, but over the last few years, YAML seems to be taking lead on storing configuration items for Java applications. So yeah, I think we're going to show both. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Well, cool. All right. Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you for your demo earlier, and thanks for joining me on this webinar. And thanks to everybody who... Oh,
sorry about that.
No worries. And thanks everybody who joined in and watched. If you have any feedback for us, you can send it to us, reply to the email. Again, we'll be sending a recording and some more information to your inbox in the next 24 to 48 hours. And we'll hopefully see you again on another webinar Wednesday on one of these upcoming webinars. But until then, thanks for watching. Happy deployments. See you next time.
Well, bye, everybody.